Millionaire disguises himself as a bricklayer and is humiliated in his own restaurant. But what he did next left all employees paralyzed. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Penrose, London's most prestigious boutique hotel. Alexander Penrose stood in his top-floor office, absently adjusting his bespoke Savile Row suit while gazing down at the bustling Mayfair street below. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world, until now. "Dad, you're not even listening to me." His daughter Charlotte's voice cut through his thoughts, bringing him back to their heated discussion. At 22, she was the spitting image of her mother. Same fierce green eyes, same determination, and the same inability to let go of an argument. "I am listening, Charlotte," Alexander replied, turning away from the window. "I simply disagree with your university dissertation's premise. The hospitality industry isn't inherently discriminatory. The Penrose, for instance, treats everyone with equal respect." Charlotte let out a frustrated laugh, her Oxford University sweater a stark contrast to the office's formal atmosphere. "Really? When was the last time you actually observed how your staff treats guests who aren't wearing designer clothes or carrying luxury handbags?" "We maintain the highest standards of service for everyone," Alexander insisted, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "That's been our family's principle since your grandfather opened this hotel in 1975. Theory versus practice, Dad. That's what my sociology professor always says." Charlotte pulled out her tablet, scrolling through her research notes. "I've been gathering data for my dissertation on social discrimination in luxury spaces, and some of the reviews I've found about the Penrose are, well, enlightening." Alexander frowned, stepping closer. "Reviews? What reviews?" "Here's one from 3 months ago. Beautiful hotel, but when I came in wearing casual clothes to inquire about afternoon tea reservations, the staff treated me like I was invisible." And another, "The maitre d' practically sneered at my regional accent." Charlotte looked up at her. "Father, these aren't isolated incidents. Those could be competitors trying to damage our reputation," Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. The Penrose had been his life's work since taking over from his father 15 years ago. He'd modernized the property, earned multiple prestigious awards, and maintained its reputation as London's most exclusive boutique hotel. The thought that his staff might be perpetuating social discrimination made his stomach churn. Charlotte stood up, gathering her research materials. "You know what, Dad? You've always taught me to face challenges head-on. Why don't you see for yourself, spend a day here as a regular person, not as Alexander Penrose, the owner?" "That's absurd," Alexander scoffed, but the idea had already taken root in his mind. "I can't just pretend to be someone else." "Why not? You're always talking about understanding the customer experience. Wouldn't this be the ultimate way to do that?" Charlotte's eyes sparkled with challenge. "Unless you're afraid of what you might discover." Alexander straightened his tie, a habit when he felt defensive. "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm simply saying it would be impractical." "Right," Charlotte said, heading for the door. "Well, I've got a lecture to attend, but think about it, Dad. Sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zone to see the truth that's right in front of us." After Charlotte left, Alexander found himself unable to focus on his work. He kept returning to the window, watching the diverse crowd passing by on the street below. Some headed to the luxury boutiques that lined the neighborhood, while others, clearly workers from nearby construction sites or delivery personnel, hurried past without a second glance at the Penrose's elegant facade. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the Penrose's recent reviews. Beyond the expected praise for the impeccable service and sophisticated atmosphere, he began to notice a pattern in the less favorable comments. They weren't about the food or the accommodations. They were about how certain guests felt unwelcome, invisible, or judged. Later that evening, as the hotel's restaurant filled with its usual well-heeled clientele, Alexander observed his staff from his office through the security cameras. He watched as Marcus, his long-serving maitre d', smoothly guided guests to their tables. He noticed how James, the celebrated head chef, emerged occasionally to greet certain tables but not others. Everything seemed perfect on the surface, yet Charlotte's words kept echoing in his mind. As he prepared to leave for the night, He passed Sarah Chen, a recently hired waitress, helping an elderly woman who appeared somewhat out of place in the luxurious setting. What caught his attention wasn't just Sarah's genuine warmth, but how she smoothly intercepted another server's dismissive glance, maintaining the guest's dignity. That night, lying in his Kensington apartment, Alexander made a decision. Charlotte was right. If he wanted to know the truth about the Penrose, he needed to experience it from a different perspective. But how to do it without arousing suspicion? The answer came to him as he recalled the construction site he'd noticed on his street that morning. Tomorrow, Alexander Penrose, the distinguished hotelier, would disappear. In his place would be Alex Peters, a construction worker looking to treat himself to lunch at a fancy hotel. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. After all, how different could the experience really be? He had no idea that this decision would not only change his perspective, but transform the Penrose forever. The next morning, Alexander stood before his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. Gone was his perfectly trimmed silver hair, hidden beneath a well-worn construction helmet. His clean-shaven face now bore a day's worth of stubble, carefully maintained to look natural rather than styled. The transformation had begun at a costume shop in Camden, where a theatrical makeup artist had helped him perfect his disguise. His usual Savile Row suit had been replaced by sturdy work boots, worn jeans, and a high-visibility jacket he'd purchased from a workwear shop in East London. The outfit felt foreign against his skin, the rough fabric a constant reminder of his mission. His manicured hands had been deliberately roughened with stage makeup to appear weathered by manual labor. "Right then, Alex Peters," he muttered to his reflection, practicing a slight northern accent he'd picked up from one of his former maintenance workers. Time to see how the other half lives. He'd chosen his timing carefully. Tuesday lunch service was always busy with business executives and ladies who lunch, creating the perfect atmosphere to test the Penrose's true character. He'd also made sure to inform his assistant that he would be unavailable all day due to personal matters, ensuring no one would question his absence. The tube ride to Mayfair felt surreal. Standing among commuters and construction workers, Alexander noticed how different people's reactions to him were. The suited professionals subtly shifted away, creating an invisible barrier. A group of tourists clutched their designer bags closer when he sat nearby. These small gestures, which he might have never noticed before, now felt like tiny paper cuts against his consciousness. Approaching the Penrose from the street provided a completely different perspective. The imposing Georgian facade, which he'd always seen as welcoming, suddenly felt intimidating. Two women in designer outfits swept past him through the revolving doors, the doorman rushing to assist them while barely glancing in his direction. Taking a deep breath, Alexander pushed through the revolving door, consciously adjusting his posture to appear less confident than usual. The marble lobby, with its crystal chandelier and elegant furnishings, seemed to emphasize his outsider status. Marcus, the maître d', was at his usual station, checking reservations with practiced efficiency. Alexander approached the desk, fighting the instinct to stand straight and command attention as he usually did. "Excuse me," he said, allowing his adopted accent to color his words. "I was wondering if you're serving lunch." Marcus barely looked up from his reservation book. "We're fully booked for lunch service today, sir." His tone carried a dismissive edge that Alexander had never heard before, or perhaps had never noticed. "Oh, I don't mind waiting if there's a cancellation," Alexander persisted, curious to see how the situation would unfold. "It's my day off, you see, and I've always wanted to try this place." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes performing a quick assessment that made Alexander's skin crawl. "I'm afraid that's unlikely. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the pub around the corner. They serve an excellent shepherd's pie." The suggestion was delivered with such smooth condescension that Alexander almost admired the technique. He'd always praised Marcus for his ability to manage difficult situations, but now he wondered how many genuine customers had been turned away with similar sophisticated dismissals. "Everything all right here?" Sarah Chen appeared beside them, carrying a stack of menus. Her warm smile included both Alexander and Marcus equally, something that now seemed surprisingly rare. "This gentleman was just leaving," Marcus began, but Sarah interjected. "Actually, table 14 just called to cancel their 1 o'clock booking." She turned to Alexander. "Would you like to take that slot? It's by the window, lovely view of the street." Marcus's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sarah, that table is usually reserved for our regular clients." "But it's available now," Sarah said cheerfully, already picking up a menu. "And we shouldn't let it go to waste, should we? Please follow me, sir." Alexander followed Sarah through the restaurant, acutely aware of the glances from other diners. Some were merely curious, others openly disapproving. He recognized several regular customers, including Lady Winchester, who quickly turned away when he caught her eye. Sarah seated him with the same graceful efficiency she showed to all guests, explaining the menu with genuine enthusiasm. "The chef's special today is magnificent, pan-seared sea bass with seasonal vegetables, though personally, I think our mushroom risotto is unbeatable." "Thank you," Alexander said, touched by her natural kindness. Most people wouldn't have bothered. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, sir. Would you like to start with still or sparkling water?" As Sarah walked away, Alexander observed the restaurant with new eyes. He watched as James, his celebrated head chef, emerged to greet certain tables with flourish, notably those occupied by social media influencers and well-known figures. The restaurant's sophisticated atmosphere, which he'd always considered welcoming, now felt like an elaborate mechanism for exclusion. His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at a nearby table. A young woman with a regional accent was attempting to send back a dish, while the server maintained a facade of politeness that barely masked his contempt. Alexander noticed Sarah once again stepping in, smoothly taking over the situation and resolving it with genuine care. As he sat there, studying the menu with its eye-watering prices, Alexander began to understand why Charlotte had been so insistent about him experiencing this perspective. The Penrose wasn't just a hotel, it was a mirror reflecting society's deeper prejudices he had been blind to from his position of privilege. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Charlotte. "How's your day going, Dad? Any interesting observations?" He smiled, realizing his daughter had known exactly what it would take to open his eyes, but his experiment was far from over. The real test would come with the arrival of his food and, more importantly, with the decisions he would make after this experience. The arrival of Alexander's meal proved to be an education in subtle discrimination. Despite Sarah's best efforts, the service he received differed markedly from what he observed at other tables. His water glass remained unfilled while servers promptly attended to other diners. The bread basket, a Penrose signature normally replenished without asking, sat empty after his first piece. As he ate his risotto, served lukewarm, he noted with growing displeasure, Alexander observed a passionate discussion between Marcus and Sarah near the kitchen entrance. Their hushed voices carried just enough for him to catch fragments of their conversation. "You can't keep seating walk-ins at premium tables," Marcus hissed. "We have standards to maintain." "The table was empty," Sarah responded firmly, "and he's been nothing but polite." "I don't understand." "You're new here," Marcus cut her off. "You don't understand our clientele. Our reputation is based on excellent service," Sarah finished. "For everyone, isn't it?" Alexander watched as Sarah walked away from the conversation, her shoulders tense but her head held high. She continued her duties with undiminished warmth, though he noticed how other staff members now gave her a wide berth. The real revelation came when James, the celebrated head chef, emerged from the kitchen. Alexander had hired him 3 years ago, impressed by both his culinary expertise and charismatic personality. Now he watched as James moved through the dining room, stopping at select tables to receive praise for his creations. When James approached a table near Alexander's, occupied by a well-known theatre director, Alexander overheard him explaining the intricate details of a dish. "The truffles are freshly imported from Alba," James boasted, "and the sauce is a family recipe passed down through generations of French cuisine." Yet when James passed Alexander's table, his expression shifted to one of barely concealed disdain. Alexander caught him muttering to a server, "At least he's not asking for ketchup," followed by subtle snickers. The comment stirred something in Alexander's memory, a complaint letter he'd dismissed 6 months ago about a chef's inappropriate remarks. At the time, he'd attributed it to an oversensitive customer. Now the pattern became clear. His observations were interrupted by an elderly couple being seated at the adjacent table. The woman reminded him of his late mother, elegant but unpretentious, wearing clothes that were well made but not obviously designer. Her companion, presumably her husband, wore a dated but dignified suit. "We're celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary," the woman mentioned softly to Sarah, who had appeared to take their order. "We've been saving up for this for months." Sarah's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful. Please let me arrange something special for your dessert." But as Sarah walked away, Alexander noticed Marcus intercepting her, speaking in low tones. When she returned to the couple's table, her expression was apologetic. "I'm so sorry, but we're actually fully committed for dessert service today." The couple's disappointment was palpable, though they tried to hide it with British restraint. "Oh, that's quite all right," the woman said, but Alexander could see her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her napkin. Something snapped inside him. He'd watched enough. This wasn't just about individual acts of discrimination. It was about a culture that had taken root in his hotel, a culture that went against everything his father had built the Penrose to be. As if sensing his growing disquiet, Sarah appeared at his table. "Is everything all right with your meal, sir?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. Alexander looked up at her, seeing now what he'd missed in all his previous interactions with staff. The simple power of treating everyone with equal dignity. "The food was—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Educational." Sarah's expression showed she understood the deeper meaning behind his comment. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "The best restaurants forget that hospitality isn't about the price of the wine or the fame of the chef. It's about making people feel welcomed." Her words struck him like a physical blow. How had he allowed the Penrose to stray so far from that basic truth? As he prepared to leave, Alexander watched Sarah discreetly slip a small plate with a chocolate truffle to the anniversary couple, accompanied by a hastily written card. The woman's eyes welled up at the gesture, while her husband patted Sarah's hand in gratitude. Marcus, noticing this interaction, immediately strode towards Sarah with a stern expression, but before he could reach her, Alexander stood up. It was time to end this charade and begin making real changes. However, just as he was about to reveal himself, another scene unfolded that would cement his resolve even further. A young woman in a hijab, dressed in business attire, entered the restaurant. She was clearly a professional, possibly from one of the many financial firms in the area. Alexander watched as Marcus smoothly directed her toward a table by the kitchen doors, despite several premium tables being visibly empty. The woman's slight flinch of recognition at the treatment was almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. That moment crystallized everything Alexander had observed throughout the day. The Penrose wasn't just failing to live up to its standards, it was actively perpetuating the very social barriers his father had worked to break down when he'd first opened the hotel. He sat back down, his hand reaching for his phone. Before he revealed himself, he needed to plan carefully. This wasn't just about correcting a few employees' behavior. It would require a complete cultural transformation, and he knew exactly where to start. The following morning, Alexander called an emergency staff meeting before the breakfast service. The Penrose's elegant conference room slowly filled with curious employees, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz of speculation. Marcus arrived precisely 5 minutes early, as always, while James sauntered in with the confident air of a man who believed his talent made him untouchable. Sarah slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. Alexander noticed how other staff members subtly shifted away from her. Another small act of exclusion he might have missed just days ago. "Good morning," Alexander began, standing at the front of the room in his usual impeccable suit. "Yesterday, something extraordinary happened at the Penrose." He paused, scanning the faces before him. A construction worker came in for lunch. The room remained silent, though several staff members exchanged confused glances. This worker received lukewarm food, sporadic service, and was treated with barely concealed disdain. Alexander reached into his briefcase and pulled out the worn, high-visibility jacket he'd worn the day before. "I know this because I was that worker." The reaction was immediate. Marcus's usually composed face drained of color. James, who had been checking his phone, suddenly sat up straight. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition, then curved into a small, knowing smile. "Sir, we had no idea," Marcus stammered, his polished demeanor cracking. "If we had known—" "That's precisely the point, Marcus," Alexander cut him off sharply. You shouldn't have needed to know who I was to treat me with dignity. The fact that you would have acted differently if you'd known my identity is exactly why we're having this meeting." He turned to address the entire room. "I spent years believing the Penrose was a beacon of excellence in hospitality. Yesterday I learned that we've confused exclusivity with exclusion, prestige with prejudice." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Penrose, our clientele expects a certain ambiance. We can't just... Our clientele expects excellence, James. Show me where in any culinary school they teach that excellence means treating people differently, based on their appearance or accent." Alexander's voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. He walked to the center of the room. "My father opened this hotel in 1975. Did any of you know he started as a dishwasher in East London?" The shocked expressions answered his question. "He built the Penrose on a simple principle. Luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about making everyone feel extraordinary." Sarah's voice came softly from the back. "That's why the original Penrose motto was, 'Where every guest is royalty.'" Alexander smiled. "Exactly. A motto we've forgotten, it seems. But that changes today." He moved to the presentation screen and clicked a remote. "I'm announcing several immediate changes." The screen illuminated with his first slide. "Starting next week, we're introducing a new lunch menu, the Heritage Menu. High-quality dishes at accessible prices, served with the same excellence as our premium menu. Sarah Chen will be promoted to Guest Relations Manager, overseeing our new inclusivity training program." Murmurs rippled through the room. Marcus's face had shifted from shock to barely concealed outrage. "Sir, with all due respect, this could damage our reputation. Our regular clients will benefit from experiencing true hospitality, Marcus, as will everyone else who walks through our doors." Alexander's tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. "But the biggest change starts with our staff." He clicked to the next slide. "We're implementing a blind service review system. Every guest will receive the same feedback card, regardless of their appearance or spending power. Staff evaluations and bonuses will be tied to these reviews. Excellence isn't about who you serve, it's about how you serve." James stood up abruptly. "This is absurd. I didn't train at Le Cordon Bleu to serve pub food." "No, you trained to create extraordinary culinary experiences," Alexander corrected him. "Unless you believe your skills only work for certain social classes." The chef sat down, face flushed. Alexander continued, "I'm also announcing the Community Table initiative. Once a month we'll host a special dinner where local community members join our regular clients. Different backgrounds, shared experiences." He could see the resistance in some faces, the uncertainty in others, but he also saw hope, particularly in the younger staff members who had often seemed uncomfortable with the unspoken prejudices they were expected to maintain. "I understand this is a significant change," Alexander acknowledged. "Some of you may choose to leave, and that's your right. But for those who stay, we have the opportunity to prove that true luxury isn't about keeping people out. It's about lifting people up." Sarah raised her hand. "I have some ideas about the training program, Mr. Penrose, including perspectives from various community members who could share their experiences." "Excellent, Sarah. We'll discuss those after the meeting." Alexander turned back to the group. "You have until tomorrow to decide if you want to be part of this new chapter. Those who stay will need to embrace these changes completely. Those who can't..." He left the sentence unfinished. As the staff filed out, their reactions ranging from excitement to thinly veiled hostility, Alexander knew the real challenges were just beginning. Marcus lingered behind, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he began, "I've served the Penrose for 15 years, and I value your experience, Marcus. But the question is, are you willing to serve all our guests with that same dedication?" The maitre d' straightened his tie, a habit Alexander recognized as a sign of internal conflict. "I'll need to think about it." "Take the day," Alexander replied. "But remember, tomorrow we make history with or without you." As the room emptied, Sarah approached with a thick folder. "I've been keeping notes about guest experiences," she said, "both good and bad. They might help with developing the training program." Alexander smiled, recognizing in her the same spirit of innovation and inclusivity that had driven his father. "Tell me everything," he said, pulling up a chair. "We have a lot of work to do." The first week of the Penrose's transformation proved to be as challenging as Alexander had anticipated. The heritage menu launch attracted a diverse crowd that sent ripples of discomfort through the traditional staff. Sarah's appointment as guest relations manager was met with a mix of quiet support and barely concealed skepticism. Marcus had returned the day after the announcement, his decision to stay seemingly more about pride than acceptance. "I suppose someone needs to maintain some standards," he'd muttered to James, unaware that Alexander was within earshot. The head chef himself had been surprisingly quiet, though his passive resistance manifested in subtle ways. Delayed orders for heritage menu items, less attention to presentation, and a constant stream of complaints about compromising culinary integrity. On this particular morning, Alexander stood in the lobby, observing the breakfast service. The dining room had a different energy now, with tables occupied by a more diverse mix of guests. A group of young professionals in casual attire sat near a window, while a retired teacher treated herself to the heritage menu's eggs Benedict. The contrast highlighted exactly what the Penrose had been missing. Sarah approached him, tablet in hand. "The first week's feedback cards are quite revealing," she said, pulling up a chart. "Overall satisfaction is actually up by 12%, but we're seeing some interesting patterns in service consistency." Alexander studied the data. "Let me guess, heritage menu customers getting slower service." "Among other things," Sarah nodded. "But there's something else you should see." She swiped to another screen, showing a series of positive reviews. "These are all from our traditional clientele. Many are praising the renewed energy and vibrant atmosphere." Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices from the kitchen. James had emerged, his chef's whites immaculate as always, confronting a young woman who appeared close to tears. "If you can't afford the full menu, you shouldn't expect the same level of accommodation," James was saying, his voice carrying across the lobby. "The heritage menu is already a considerable concession." Before Sarah could move, Alexander was already striding toward them. "Is there a problem here?" The young woman, who Alexander recognized as a local university student who'd become a regular at breakfast, spoke up. "I just asked if the eggs could be poached instead of scrambled since I'm allergic to butter." "The heritage menu items are fixed," James insisted. "We can't customize every order just because—" "Just because what, James?" Alexander's voice was quiet but firm. "Just because she's not paying $45 for breakfast. Is hospitality now measured by pounds sterling?" The chef's face reddened. "Sir, if we start making exceptions, the only exception here is your attitude." Alexander turned to the student. "I'm Alexander Penrose, and I apologize for this situation. Of course, we can accommodate your dietary requirements. Sarah, would you please ensure our guest's order is properly handled?" As Sarah led the grateful student away, Alexander gestured for James to follow him to his office. The walk was silent, tension building with each step. Inside the office, Alexander didn't sit down. "Do you know why I hired you, James?" The chef stood stiffly. "Because I'm one of the best chefs in London." "No. I hired you because 3 years ago, you told me cooking was about making people happy." "What happened to that chef?" James shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, maintaining our standards is about excellence in every dish we serve, regardless of its price point or who ordered it." Alexander moved to his desk, pulling out a file. "Did you know our heritage menu has brought in 30% more revenue than projected? People who never felt welcomed here are becoming regular customers. They're telling their friends, family, colleagues. But our reputation is growing stronger," Alexander finished. "True luxury isn't about exclusivity, James. It's about making everyone feel special." The chef's facade cracked slightly. "The other day," he admitted reluctantly, "a heritage menu customer told me the eggs Benedict reminded her of her honeymoon in Paris. She'd saved up for months to stay at a fancy hotel there. Said our breakfast made her feel that way again." Alexander smiled. "That's the magic of hospitality. You haven't lost your touch, James. You've just forgotten who you're cooking for." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah knocking on the door. "Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this." She handed Alexander a tablet open to a prominent food blog. The article's headline read, "The Penrose Revolution: How London's most exclusive hotel became its most inclusive without losing its edge." The piece praised the heritage menu's quality and the hotel's new atmosphere, calling it a masterclass in modern luxury. This went live an hour ago, Sarah reported. Our booking system is already seeing increased traffic. James read over Alexander's shoulder, his expression thoughtful. The heritage menu could use some seasonal adjustments, he said finally. Perhaps a special that changes weekly, using premium ingredients but keeping the accessible price point. Alexander recognized the olive branch for what it was. Why don't you and Sarah work on that together? She's been collecting guest feedback that might help inform the menu development. As they left his office, Alexander noticed something else. James held the door for Sarah, treating her with the same respect he usually reserved for senior staff. It was a small gesture, but it represented exactly the kind of change he'd been hoping to see. Later that afternoon, Alexander watched from his office as Marcus efficiently handled a full house, treating heritage menu customers with the same polished service he'd previously reserved for premium guests. The maitre d' was still struggling with the changes, but his professional pride was winning out over his prejudices. Charlotte's words from that fateful argument echoed in his mind. Theory versus practice, Dad. The theory of equality was easy. It was the practice that required constant attention, adjustment, and commitment. But as he watched the diverse mix of guests enjoying their meals, engaging in conversation across social boundaries that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, Alexander knew they were on the right path. The Penrose was changing, one meal, one interaction, one person at a time. The success of the Penrose's transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 weeks into the changes, the heritage menu had developed a devoted following, and the restaurant was consistently full during lunch service. Yet beneath the surface of this success, tensions were brewing. Lady Henrietta Winchester, a longtime patron of the Penrose, sat at her usual corner table, her expression growing increasingly sour as she surveyed the dining room. The space that had once been her exclusive sanctuary now hummed with a diverse energy she clearly found disturbing. When Marcus approached her table, she barely contained her disdain. "I suppose this is all permanent then?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the surrounding tables where heritage menu diners sat alongside traditional patrons. "This experiment of Alexander's?" Marcus hesitated, his loyalty to the old guard warring with his new directives. "Mr. Penrose has implemented several changes to enhance our guest experience, my lady." "Enhanced?" She raised an eyebrow. "I had to wait 10 minutes for my table yesterday because it was occupied by people clearly here on some sort of discount arrangement." "The heritage menu is a carefully curated selection," Marcus began, but Lady Winchester cut him off. "I've been coming here for 20 years, Marcus. My family has held every significant celebration at the Penrose since before Alexander was born. Surely you understand my concerns?" The conversation was overheard by Sarah, who was training new staff members nearby. She watched as Marcus's posture shifted, noting how he leaned in conspiratorially towards Lady Winchester. "Perhaps," Marcus said quietly, "some of us share your concerns, my lady. Change isn't always progress." Later that afternoon, Sarah found Alexander in his office, reviewing the latest guest satisfaction data. "We might have a problem," she announced, closing the door behind her. Alexander looked up from his computer. "The booking system crash again?" "No, it's more serious than that." Sarah detailed the conversation she'd overheard, along with other concerning patterns she'd noticed. "There's a growing resistance movement. Some of the old guard staff are holding secret meetings in the wine cellar after hours. They're worried about protecting the Penrose's legacy." Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "Anyone specific besides Marcus?" "James has attended a few meetings, though he seems less convinced lately. But it's not just staff. Several long-time patrons are involved. They're threatening to take their business elsewhere, and they're trying to convince others to do the same." "They're welcome to leave," Alexander said firmly, though Sarah noticed the slight tension in his jaw. "It's not that simple," she pressed. "They're spreading rumors about declining standards, claiming the heritage menu is just the beginning of a complete downmarket shift. Lady Winchester has significant influence in London's social circles." Before Alexander could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte. "Dad, you might want to check Mayfair Social Magazine's website." He pulled up the site on his computer, Sarah moving to read over his shoulder. The Penrose's identity crisis raises eyebrows in London's elite circles. The article was a masterpiece of subtle criticism, quoting anonymous sources, claiming that the Penrose was sacrificing its unique character in a misguided attempt at social engineering. It particularly targeted the Community Table initiative, suggesting it would dilute the exclusive atmosphere that made the Penrose special. "They're trying to pressure you into reversing the changes," Sarah observed. The headline made them both wince. Trouble in Paradise. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below where people of all backgrounds now felt comfortable entering his hotel. "My father faced similar resistance when he first opened the Penrose," he said quietly. "The old guard thought a former dishwasher had no business running a luxury hotel. What did he do? He proved them wrong." Alexander turned back to face Sarah. "And so will we. But we need to be smart about this." He moved to his desk and pressed the intercom. "Clara, please schedule an emergency management meeting for tomorrow morning. All department heads, including Marcus and James." After releasing the button, he looked at Sarah. "We're not just fighting against prejudice. We're fighting for the soul of the Penrose. These people think they're protecting the hotel's legacy, but they're actually threatening everything it was meant to stand for." Sarah nodded, then remembered something else. "There's one more thing you should know. The community table bookings for next week. Someone's been cancelling them without authorization. I've managed to catch and reinstate most of them, but..." Alexander's expression hardened. "Direct sabotage now. Find out who's responsible. And Sarah, be careful. Not everyone is happy about your promotion." As if to emphasize his point, they heard raised voices from the hallway. A group of servers was arguing, and through the door came clear words. "Ever since she became manager, everything's gone downhill. Who does she think she is?" Sarah straightened her shoulders, but Alexander caught the brief flash of hurt in her eyes. "They'll adjust," she said, more to herself than to him. "They'll adjust or they'll leave," Alexander corrected firmly. "But first, we need to handle this situation with Lady Winchester and her allies. They think they can pressure us into submission? Let's show them what real hospitality looks like." A plan was forming in his mind, one that would either unite the Penrose's divided staff or expose the true extent of the resistance they faced. Either way, the next few days would determine the future of everything they'd worked to build. The morning management meeting was about to begin when an unexpected visitor arrived at the Penrose. Margaret Chen, Sarah's grandmother, and a former employee of the hotel, walked into the lobby with quiet dignity. At 78, she carried herself with the same grace that had marked her 20-year tenure as the hotel's head housekeeper, a position she'd held during Alexander's father's time. Alexander, on his way to the meeting room, stopped in his tracks when he saw her. "Mrs. Chen," he called out, genuine warmth in his voice. "What a wonderful surprise." Margaret smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Young Master Alexander," she said, using the name she'd called him since his childhood. "Sarah told me about the changes you're making. I thought perhaps it was time I shared something with you." Alexander glanced at his watch, then at the meeting room where his staff was gathering. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, would you mind sharing it with everyone? I think we could all benefit from your perspective." Minutes later, Margaret stood before the assembled management team, her presence commanding attention despite her small stature. Marcus and James shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Sarah beamed with pride at her grandmother. "In 1975, Margaret began, when Mr. Penrose Sr. hired me, many people said he was making a mistake. A Chinese immigrant as head housekeeper in one of London's finest hotels. Unthinkable." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "But your father, Alexander, he said something I never forgot. Excellence knows no background and dignity has no class." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a weathered, leather-bound book. "This was your father's original guest book. He asked me to keep it safe when he fell ill. I think it's time it came home." Alexander accepted the book with trembling hands. Opening it, he found not just guest signatures, but detailed notes in his father's handwriting. "Every guest has a story," he read aloud. "Our job is to make their story better." Margaret nodded. "Your father had a policy. One special table each night reserved for someone who couldn't typically afford the Penrose. He called it the welcome table. Sound familiar?" Alexander looked up sharply. "The community table." I thought I'd invented that. Perhaps some ideas run in the family, Margaret smiled. But there's more. Turn to page 43. Alexander did, and his breath caught. There, in faded ink, was a newspaper clipping from 1976. Penrose Hotel breaks barriers. New luxury venue welcomes all. The article detailed how his father had faced backlash from London's elite for his inclusive policies. The resistance you're facing isn't new, Margaret continued, but neither is the solution. Your father didn't just stand his ground. He proved that true luxury is about how you make people feel, not how much money they have. Lady Winchester, who had been about to enter the restaurant, stopped in the doorway of the meeting room, listening. I remember when Lady Winchester's mother first came here, Margaret said, catching the aristocrat's eye. She was newly widowed, feeling lost. Your father gave her that corner table, made sure she never dined alone. That's why she became a regular, not because of exclusivity, but because of kindness. Lady Winchester stepped into the room, her usual imperious manner softened by memory. I remember, she said quietly. Mother said it was the only place in London where she felt truly seen during that difficult time. Alexander stood up, the old guest book cradled in his hands. Then perhaps we've all forgotten what the Penrose really stands for. He turned to Marcus and James. This isn't about declining standards. It's about returning to our true standard. Every guest, every meal, every moment matters. James cleared his throat. The heritage menu. It reminds me of why I started cooking. My mum saved for months to take me to a fancy restaurant for my 10th birthday. That chef treated me like a food critic, explained every dish. It changed my life. Sarah stepped forward. That's exactly why we need the community table, the heritage menu, all of it. We're not just serving meals, we're serving moments that might change someone's life. Margaret touched the guest book gently. Your father wrote about every special guest, Alexander. Not just the famous ones. The nervous young man proposing to his girlfriend, the retired teacher celebrating her first pension check, the immigrant family marking their first year in London. Those stories built the Penrose's true reputation. Lady Winchester approached the book, her fingers tracing the aged leather. Perhaps we could start collecting those stories again. A new guest book, bridging past and present. Alexander looked around the room, seeing the shift in expressions, the softening of resistance. Not just collect them, he said. Let's celebrate them. Each month we'll feature one guest's story, regardless of which menu they order or which table they book. And for next week's community table, Sarah added, why don't we invite some of our longest-standing patrons to share their memories of the Penrose with our new guests? Lady Winchester straightened her shoulders. I would be honored to attend. Perhaps I could share the story of my mother. Margaret smiled knowingly. Every guest has a story, she repeated Alexander's father's words. And every story deserves to be heard. As the meeting dispersed, Alexander noticed Marcus lingering behind, studying the old guest book with newfound interest. Sir, the maitre d' said hesitantly, I may have been mistaken about some things. Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. We all were, Marcus, but it's never too late to write a new chapter. Later that evening, as Sarah helped her grandmother into a taxi, Margaret squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Your grandfather would be proud, she said. He always said the Penrose had magic in its walls. Now I know he was right. It just needed someone to remind it of that magic. Alexander watched them from the hotel entrance, the old guest book under his arm. They had found more than just a solution to their current crisis. They had rediscovered the true heart of the Penrose. Now it was time to ensure that heart kept beating strongly for generations to come. A week after Margaret Chen's revelatory visit, the Penrose hummed with renewed purpose. Alexander had displayed his father's guest book prominently in the lobby, its weathered pages protected behind glass, but open to a different story each day. Today's page featured a photograph from 1977, a young immigrant family celebrating their first Christmas in London, their faces glowing with joy as they sat at what would later become Lady Winchester's corner table. The impact of these daily stories was profound. Alexander watched as guests, both old and new, gathered around the display, their conversations bridging social divides that had seemed insurmountable just weeks ago. Sarah had transformed the upcoming community table event into something extraordinary. Stories of the Penrose then and now would bring together longtime patrons and new guests to share their experiences over a carefully curated menu that James had enthusiastically designed to represent different eras of the hotel's cuisine. "We're mixing heritage dishes with contemporary interpretations," James explained to Alexander, as they reviewed the menu in the kitchen. The chef's earlier resistance had transformed into passionate engagement. "Each course tells a story. Look at this starter. It's based on the very first dish your father served here, but with a modern twist." Alexander studied the description. "East meets West soup, traditional English pea soup, with Asian-inspired dumplings, celebrating Margaret Chen's influence on the Penrose's culinary history." "The dumplings are filled with Yorkshire pudding batter," James added, his eyes sparkling with creative energy. "It shouldn't work, but somehow it's magnificent, just like the Penrose itself." Marcus, too, had undergone a remarkable transformation. After reading through the old guest book, he'd approached Sarah with an idea for a mentoring program. "Many of our heritage menu guests are experiencing fine dining for the first time," he'd explained. "What if we offered optional dining etiquette sessions? Not to make them feel uncomfortable, but to help them feel more confident." Sarah had refined the concept, suggesting they pair it with cultural awareness training for the staff. "Learning goes both ways," she'd pointed out. "Our team needs to understand and respect different cultural norms around dining, just as much as guests might want to learn about fine dining traditions." The morning's post brought another surprise, a letter from Lady Winchester. Alexander opened it in his office, Sarah sitting across from him. "Dear Alexander, your father once told my mother that true nobility isn't inherited. It's earned through how we treat others. I confess I had forgotten that lesson until recently. The story of my mother's first visits to the Penrose will be my contribution to next week's community table event. I've also enclosed a rather substantial donation to support the Heritage Menu program. However, money isn't the only thing I can offer. I would like to propose becoming a patron of what I'm calling the Penrose Fellowship, a program to provide hospitality training and mentorship to young people from underserved communities. Perhaps we could discuss this over tea. Yours sincerely, Henrietta Winchester." Sarah leaned back in her chair, smiling. "From resistance to revolution. Who would have thought?" "My father would have," Alexander replied, touching the frame on his desk that held a photo of the Penrose's opening day. "He always said that people just need to be given the chance to be their best selves." Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the lobby. A group of culinary students from a local community college was arriving for their first day of work experience, another of Sarah's initiatives. Among them was a young woman in a hijab, who Alexander recognized as the guest who had been seated by the kitchen doors during his undercover visit. "Amira has incredible potential," James said, appearing in the doorway. "When she mentioned she was studying culinary arts, I reviewed her application personally. Her fusion of British and Middle Eastern flavors is exactly what the Penrose needs." Alexander watched as Sarah introduced the students to Marcus, who was explaining the hotel's service philosophy with genuine enthusiasm. The maitre d' had even adjusted his usual stance on formal attire, working with Sarah to create guidelines that respected religious and cultural dress while maintaining professional standards. The morning's deliveries included a special package, a new guest book, bound in deep blue leather with silver embossing. Alexander had commissioned it after finding references in his father's notes to a tradition of recording not just signatures, but stories. "Your father understood that luxury isn't just about the physical experience," Sarah observed, running her fingers over the fresh pages. "It's about making memories." As if to prove her point, the elderly couple Alexander had observed during his undercover visit, the ones celebrating their 50th anniversary, walked through the lobby. They were back for their monthly Heritage Menu lunch, but this time they were accompanied by their grandchildren, eager to experience the place their grandparents hadn't stopped talking about. One of the new servers immediately recognized them, hurrying over with warm greetings. On their table, Alexander noticed, was a small silver frame containing a photo from their anniversary celebration, another of Sarah's touches for returning guests. The transformation of the Penrose was far from complete, but watching the old and new blend together so seamlessly, Alexander felt a deep sense of rightness. They weren't just preserving his father's legacy, they were building upon it, creating something even more meaningful for the future. As lunchtime approached, the lobby filled with a diverse mix of guests. Business executives sat next to construction workers at the bar. Elderly patrons chatted with young students in the lounge, and the sounds of different accents and languages created a symphony of inclusion that would have made his father proud. The Penrose was becoming exactly what it was always meant to be. Not just a luxury hotel, but a place where every story mattered, where excellence meant treating everyone with equal dignity, and where true hospitality knew no boundaries. The day before the Stories of the Penrose Then and Now event, the hotel buzzed with anticipation. The grand dining room was being transformed under Sarah's meticulous direction. Each table would tell its own story, photographs and mementos carefully curated to represent different eras of the Penrose's history. The seating arrangement is crucial, Sarah explained to Alexander, showing him the carefully crafted floor plan. We're pairing each longtime patron with new guests who share something in common. Lady Winchester, for instance, will be seated with a young widow who recently started coming here for our heritage menu brunches. Alexander studied the plan, noting how thoughtfully each pairing had been considered. "And here?" he asked, pointing to a central table. Sarah smiled. "That's where Mrs. Chen will sit. We've gathered some of the staff members she trained over the years, including 3 who went on to manage other prestigious hotels. They're flying in specially for the event." The kitchen was equally alive with activity. James had transformed his initial skepticism into passionate creativity, working alongside Amira to create a menu that bridged cultures and generations. The young culinary student had proved to be an unexpected catalyst for change, her fresh perspectives challenging the chef's traditional approaches. "Try this," James called out as Alexander and Sarah entered the kitchen. He offered them small spoonfuls of a golden soup. It's Amira's interpretation of the East meets West concept. She's incorporated her grandmother's spice blend into the traditional pea soup base. The flavor was extraordinary, familiar yet exotic, comforting yet exciting. "This needs to go on the regular menu," Alexander declared, watching Amira's face light up with pride. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking unusually casual in his shirt sleeves. "Sir, you need to see this." He led them to the lobby where a steady stream of people was arriving, each carrying something to contribute to the event's historical display. A retired bellhop had brought his original uniform from the 1980s. An elderly couple presented a champagne cork from their engagement celebration decades ago. A local artist arrived with a portfolio of sketches she'd made while sitting in the lobby over the years, capturing moments of both grand celebrations and quiet dignity. "It's becoming more than just an event," Sarah observed. "It's like the whole community is helping to weave together the Penrose's story." As they watched, a group of students from the local culinary academy arrived for their pre-event briefing. Among them was Tommy, a young man from a council estate who had initially been intimidated by the Penrose's grandeur. Now, under James's mentorship, he moved through the kitchen with growing confidence. "Remember when he could barely look us in the eye?" Marcus mused, watching Tommy expertly plate a practice dish. "Now he's teaching some of our regular staff new techniques." The transformation wasn't limited to the new arrivals. Alexander noticed how his veteran staff members had begun to take pride in their role as mentors, sharing their expertise while remaining open to fresh perspectives. Even the most resistant old guard had been won over by the undeniable energy and vibrancy that the changes had brought. Late in the afternoon, Charlotte arrived to help with the final preparations. She carried a thick folder of research materials. "Dad, you won't believe what I found in the university archives," she said excitedly. "Original reviews of the Penrose from 1975. Listen to this. In a bold departure from London's stuffier establishments, the Penrose dares to suggest that luxury can be inclusive without losing its shine." Alexander took the yellowed newspaper clipping, recognizing the truth that had somehow been forgotten over the years. "We're not changing the Penrose's identity," he realized. "We're reclaiming it." As evening approached, Sarah gathered the entire staff for a final briefing. The grand dining room gleamed in the setting sun, each table perfect, each story waiting to be shared. The walls, usually adorned with traditional artwork, now displayed a carefully curated timeline of photographs and mementos, telling the Penrose's story through the faces of its guests and staff. "Tomorrow isn't just about celebrating our past," Sarah told the assembled team. "It's about showing what hospitality really means, creating moments where everyone feels like they belong." James stepped forward, his chef's whites crisp and pristine. Each dish we serve tomorrow carries a story, he explained. When Lady Winchester tastes the updated version of her mother's favorite dessert, she'll recognize the classic elements, but discover something new. When our heritage menu regulars experience our most luxurious offerings, they'll understand that fine dining isn't about exclusivity. It's about care and creativity. Marcus added his own thoughts, his usual formality softened by genuine emotion. Tomorrow, we don't just serve meals. We serve memories. We serve dignity. We serve the very essence of what the Penrose has always meant to be. As the staff dispersed to their final preparations, Alexander found himself alone in the dining room. The space seemed to hold its breath, ready for the stories that would unfold within its walls. Tomorrow would be more than just an event. It would be a moment of truth, a celebration of everything they'd fought to achieve, and a blueprint for the future they were building. In the fading light, he could almost see the shadows of past guests mingling with the promise of those yet to come. The Penrose was no longer just a luxury hotel. It had become a tapestry of intersecting lives, each thread essential to its beauty. Outside, the first preview copies of next month's Mayfair Social magazine had been delivered. The cover story? The Penrose Renaissance. How London's grande dame of hospitality rediscovered her soul. Tomorrow would prove just how true that headline was. The evening of Stories of the Penrose Then and Now arrived with an air of electric anticipation. The grand dining room had been transformed into a living museum of memories, with each table representing a different chapter in the hotel's history. Soft lighting created an intimate atmosphere, while subtle spotlights illuminated the historical photographs and mementos that lined the walls. Sarah stood at the entrance, elegant in a midnight blue dress, greeting guests as they arrived. The mix was exactly as they'd hoped. Long-time patrons in their finest attire, mingling with heritage menu regulars who had become part of the Penrose family. Everyone received the same warm welcome, the same careful attention to detail. Lady Winchester arrived early, accompanied by Emma Thompson, the young widow she'd been paired with. Any initial awkwardness dissolved as they discovered shared experiences of finding solace in the Penrose during difficult times. "My mother always said this place had healing powers," Lady Winchester confided to Emma. "Something about the way they make you feel like you matter, especially when you're feeling lost." Emma nodded, understanding. "That's exactly why I started coming here for Sunday brunch. Sarah always made sure I had company if I wanted it, or privacy if I needed it." Margaret Chen's arrival created a stir of excitement. Former staff members gathered around her, sharing hugs and memories. She moved through the room like a queen, stopping to touch a photograph here, share a story there. When she reached the display of her old housekeeping uniform, carefully preserved and mounted alongside her handwritten training manual, tears glistened in her eyes. "We've added something special," Alexander said, guiding her to a new frame being unveiled. It contained a formal declaration, the Margaret Chen Excellence in Service Award, a yearly recognition for staff members who exemplified the perfect balance of professional excellence and human kindness. James emerged from the kitchen to announce the first course, his usual bravado tempered by genuine emotion. "Tonight's menu is a collaboration across generations," he explained. "Each dish tells a story of the Penrose's evolution." The East Meets West soup arrived, presented by Amira herself. "This recipe combines my grandmother's spice blend with traditional British ingredients," she explained to each table, "just as the Penrose combines tradition with innovation." At the central table, Margaret Chen tasted the soup and smiled broadly. "It tastes like belonging," she declared, causing Amira to blush with pleasure. Between courses, guests were encouraged to share their Penrose stories. A local artist who'd been coming to the hotel for decades displayed sketches she'd made over the years. Businessmen in the 1980s, young couples in the 1990s, families in the 2000s. Through her art, the evolution of the Penrose became visible. Marcus, impeccable in his formal attire, moved between tables with unprecedented warmth. He stopped to help a nervous young man perfect his table etiquette, showing the same patience and respect he'd once reserved for his most elite guests. "You know," he confided to Alexander, "I've served more genuine smiles in the past month than forced pleasantries in the last year." The evening's centerpiece was a special dessert, a masterful collaboration between James and Tommy, the young apprentice from the council estate. They called it the Penrose Legacy, a sophisticated reimagining of traditional bread and butter pudding, elevated with French techniques and Middle Eastern influences. "This dessert represents everything we are now," James announced proudly. Classic British comfort food, prepared with French finesse, enhanced by global flavors and made accessible to everyone. As guests savored the dessert, Alexander rose to speak. The room fell silent, every face turned toward him expectantly. "My father opened the Penrose with a simple belief that true luxury isn't about exclusivity, but about making everyone feel extraordinary. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. But thanks to my daughter Charlotte's challenge, Sarah's vision, and the courage of every person in this room to embrace change, we've not just remembered it, we've renewed it." He gestured to the walls of photographs, the tables of happy guests, the staff members who had become family. "Look around this room. Every person here has a Penrose story. Some span decades, some are just beginning, but each one is equally valuable, equally worth celebrating." Charlotte, who had been documenting the evening for her now completed dissertation, stood up. "It's proof that change is possible, that traditions can evolve without being lost, that luxury can be inclusive without losing its magic." As if to emphasize her point, Tommy emerged from the kitchen carrying a surprise addition to the dessert course. Perfectly crafted petit fours arranged to recreate the Penrose's original logo. "The Penrose isn't just a hotel," she added. The detail was exquisite, the execution flawless. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have dared to walk through these doors," Tommy admitted to the appreciative crowd. "Now I'm helping create its future. That's the Penrose magic, isn't it? Making people believe in themselves." The evening continued late into the night, stories flowing as freely as the champagne. Old barriers crumbled as guests discovered shared experiences across social divides. Lady Winchester was overheard exchanging recipe tips with a heritage menu regular. Margaret Chen's former trainees shared professional advice with current staff members. In a quiet moment, Sarah found Alexander watching the scene from a corner. "Look at what we've created," she said softly. Alexander shook his head. "Look at what we've restored," he corrected. This was always the Penrose's true nature. We just needed to remember it. As the event drew to a close, guests lingered, reluctant to let the magic end. But Alexander knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The Penrose had rediscovered its soul, and tomorrow would bring new stories, new chances to prove that luxury and inclusivity could not just coexist, but enhance each other. The night's success was measured not in pounds sterling or social media buzz, but in the genuine connections forged, the barriers broken, and the dignity restored. The Penrose had become more than a hotel. It had become a beacon of possibility, showing that change, when guided by compassion and commitment, could transform not just a business, but the very fabric of society. 1 month after the stories of the Penrose event, Alexander sat in his office reviewing a stack of newspapers and magazines. The coverage had been extraordinary. The Penrose Effect headlined the Hospitality Monthly. "Revolution in Luxury: How One Hotel Changed the Game," declared the London Business Review. But what truly caught his attention was the pile of letters on his desk. "Dear Mr. Penrose," one began, written on the letterhead of a prestigious Edinburgh hotel, "your recent transformation has inspired us to reconsider our own approach to hospitality." Another, from a small family-owned boutique hotel in Bath. "After reading about your heritage menu initiative, we've launched our own community outreach program." Sarah entered the office carrying even more correspondence. "The Hospitality Association wants you to give the keynote at their annual conference," she announced. "And 3 more hotels have requested our training program guidelines." Alexander smiled, remembering his father's words. "Change one heart, and you start a revolution." The Penrose's transformation was proving to be more than just a successful business strategy. It had become a movement. James burst into the office, his chef's whites splattered with sauce, his face animated. "You won't believe who just called. The Michelin Committee. They're introducing a new category for inclusive excellence in their next guide, and they want the Penrose to be their benchmark example." The changes within the hotel had continued to evolve organically. The heritage menu, initially launched as a separate offering, had influenced the entire dining program. James now rotated dishes between the menus based on popularity rather than price point, breaking down the artificial barriers between luxury and accessible cuisine. Marcus had fully embraced his role as a mentor, establishing what he called the Penrose Protocol, a training program that combined traditional service standards with modern inclusivity practices. Hotels across London were sending their staff to learn from him. "We've had an interesting development," Sarah said, pulling up a presentation on her tablet. "Remember that group of regular Heritage menu customers who work in tech? They've developed a booking app specifically for inclusive luxury experiences. They want the Penrose to be their launch partner." Lady Winchester, who had become one of the hotel's most passionate advocates for change, had expanded her fellowship program beyond the Penrose. She now coordinated with a network of luxury hotels to provide training opportunities for young people from underserved communities. "The most remarkable thing," she told Alexander over tea that afternoon, "is how it's changing perspectives on both sides. These young people aren't just learning about hospitality. They're teaching us about authenticity and innovation." As if to prove her point, Tommy rushed past them, now wearing a junior chef's uniform with clear authority. He was leading a workshop for visiting culinary students, his previous nervousness replaced by quiet confidence. "The best soufflé isn't about the most expensive vanilla," they overheard him saying. "It's about understanding the science and caring about the details. Luxury is in the love you put into it, not the price tag." Charlotte had successfully defended her dissertation, earning the highest honors. Her research on the Penrose's transformation was being developed into a case study for business schools, examining how social responsibility and commercial success could work in harmony. But perhaps the most significant change was in the small, daily interactions. Alexander watched as a construction worker and a baronet discussed cricket at the bar, their shared passion for the sport transcending social boundaries. In the restaurant, a famous actress sat comfortably next to a retired schoolteacher, both enjoying James's latest creation. Margaret Chen, who now regularly hosted tea ceremonies in the hotel's lounge, shared her wisdom with a group of hospitality students. "A great hotel is like a great family. It grows stronger by embracing differences, not by enforcing sameness." The physical space of the Penrose had evolved as well. The lobby now featured a digital version of the guest book, where visitors could share their stories through text or video. The walls displayed a rotating exhibition of photographs showing the hotel's journey, including candid shots from the Heritage menu's early days. Even the resistant elements of London's old guard had begun to come around. Those who had initially threatened to take their business elsewhere now returned, drawn by the hotel's vibrant atmosphere and unwavering commitment to excellence. "You know what's truly remarkable?" Sarah mused during their weekly management meeting. "We haven't just changed how we treat guests. We've changed how guests treat each other." She was right. The Penrose had become a space where social barriers naturally dissolved, where genuine connections formed across traditional divides. Other hotels were taking notice, not just in London, but internationally. A luxury hotel in Paris had launched its own version of the community table. A grand old establishment in New York was redesigning its service philosophy based on the Penrose model. Even a traditional ryokan in Kyoto had reached out to discuss how to balance cultural preservation with social inclusion. As Alexander walked through his hotel that evening, he noticed something that would have seemed impossible just months ago. The energy was different, more genuine, more alive. Every space buzzed with authentic conversation and connection. At the bar, Marcus was teaching a group of young professionals the finer points of wine tasting, while James and Amira presented a new fusion dish to an enthusiastic food blogger. Lady Winchester sat at her usual corner table, but now she was hosting a mentoring session with aspiring hospitality students. The Penrose hadn't just changed itself, it had become a catalyst for change in the entire industry. And this, Alexander realized, was perhaps his father's greatest legacy. The proof that one establishment, by staying true to its values, could transform not just its own future, but the future of hospitality itself. 1 year to the day after Alexander's undercover visit to his own hotel, the Penrose buzzed with the energy of a special celebration. The lobby had been transformed into a gallery showcasing photographs and stories from the past year's journey. The centerpiece was a striking image. Alexander in his construction worker disguise, seated next to his current self, a visual representation of how far they'd come. "Quite a difference a year makes," Charlotte remarked, standing beside her father as they surveyed the scene. She'd just returned from a conference where she'd presented her research, now published in a leading hospitality journal. "Though I never imagined my sociology dissertation would lead to all this." The occasion was the launch of the Penrose Institute for Inclusive Hospitality, a training center and think tank dedicated to spreading the principles that had transformed the Penrose. The hotel's journey had become more than a success story. It had become a model for change. Sarah, now Director of Guest Experience and Innovation, led a group of international hoteliers through the space. "The key was realizing that true luxury isn't about exclusivity," she explained. "It's about creating moments of extraordinary connection for every guest." The heritage menu had evolved into something even more meaningful. Instead of being a separate offering, it had influenced the entire dining program. James had created what he called borderless cuisine, dishes that honored tradition while embracing innovation, priced to be accessible without compromising quality. Food should bring people together, not keep them apart, James told a group of culinary students, including several from the fellowship program. He gestured to Amira, now his sous chef, who was demonstrating a technique that merged classical French cooking with Middle Eastern spices. Excellence knows no boundaries. Marcus, who had initially resisted the changes most strongly, had become one of their most passionate advocates. His training programs in inclusive service excellence were now mandatory for luxury hotels across London. "Dignity isn't a luxury," he often said. "It's a fundamental right." Lady Winchester arrived, accompanied by the first graduates of her fellowship program. Among them was Tommy, now a fully qualified chef preparing to open his own restaurant. "The Penrose showed me that dreams don't have a dress code," he said, hugging Margaret Chen, who had become a mentor to many of the young trainees. The hotel's success had proved that social responsibility and commercial success weren't mutually exclusive. The Penrose's revenue had increased by 40%, but more importantly, its impact had grown immeasurably. Other hotels were following their lead, creating their own versions of the community table and heritage menu. "Your father would be proud," Margaret told Alexander, watching as guests from all walks of life mingled comfortably in the space that had once been a symbol of exclusivity. "He always said the Penrose had the power to change lives. He just didn't know how many lives it would change." Alexander looked around at what the Penrose had become. The original guest book, still displayed prominently in the lobby, had been joined by a digital story wall where guests could share their experiences in real time. Each entry was a testament to the hotel's transformation. A construction worker celebrating his daughter's graduation, a titled lady sharing tea with a local artist, a tourist finding unexpected friendship with a regular guest. These weren't just stories, they were proof that change was possible, that traditions could evolve without being lost, that luxury could be redefined without being diminished. "The most remarkable thing," Sarah observed, joining Alexander as he watched the celebrations, "is that none of this feels remarkable anymore. It's just who we are now." She was right. The artificial barriers that had once seemed so important had dissolved, replaced by genuine connections. The Penrose had become what it was always meant to be, not just a luxury hotel, but a place where every person's story mattered, where excellence meant treating everyone with equal dignity, and where true hospitality knew no bounds. As evening fell, Alexander found himself in his office looking down at the street below, just as he had that day when Charlotte first challenged his assumptions. The view was the same, but his perspective had changed entirely. The Penrose was no longer just his father's legacy. It had become something more, something that would continue to evolve and inspire long after his time. Charlotte joined him at the window. "You know what makes me happiest?" she said, watching the diverse mix of guests entering the hotel. "It's not just that we changed the Penrose. It's that the Penrose is changing the world one story at a time." Alexander smiled, remembering his father's words now inscribed in gold letters in the lobby. "Every guest has a story. Our job is to make their story better." The Penrose had finally fulfilled that promise, not just for some guests, but for everyone who walked through its doors. The sound of laughter drew them back to the celebration. James was unveiling a special anniversary dish, while Marcus shared stories with a group of wide-eyed hospitality students. Sarah was introducing two guests who had traveled from opposite ends of the earth, yet found common ground in their Penrose experiences. And there, in the midst of it all, stood Margaret Chen, her presence a bridge between past and present, tradition and innovation, the hotel that was and the hotel it had become. In the end, she often said, luxury isn't about gold fixtures or fancy names. It's about making people feel like they belong. The Penrose had done more than belong. It had become a beacon, showing the hospitality industry and the world beyond that change was possible, that inclusion and excellence could coexist, and that the greatest luxury of all was the simple dignity of dignity, being welcomed exactly as you are. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander made his way through the crowd, stopping to chat with guests both old and new, each conversation a reminder of why this journey had been worth every challenge. The Penrose wasn't just a hotel anymore, it was a promise kept, a revolution realized, and a story that would continue to unfold for generations to come.